Hello, my name is Whitney Carradine, presenting from Liberty University's Social Psychology online course. For today's topic, we will be discussing Part 2 of Social Perception, which entails stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice. As an overview, I will be reviewing social perception, then I will go into detail on topics such as stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, the underlying issues of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, social categories, relative deprivations, and the two articles, The Ironic Impact of Activists, Negative Stereotypes Reduce Social Change and Influence, and the article Music Preference, Social Identity, and Self-Esteem. So, let's get started. As discussed in last week's module, social perception was defined as a general term for the process by which people come to understand one another. In other words, social perception is our formed impression of other individuals. In order to make sense of all of that information we gather throughout the day, it is natural to group like things together. However, when dealing with people, it is important to allow others to be unique when they are a part of a particular group. While keeping that in mind, we're going to move on to some important terms that will be used and discussed throughout this presentation. As defined in our social psychology textbook, stereotypes are beliefs or association that links an entire group of people together who have a certain characteristic or trait. For an example, a stereotype could be blondes are dumb, or math majors are geeks, or even car salesmen can't be trusted. Although these statements aren't 100% true, they are still thoughts and stereotypes that may still be used and believed to be true today. Moving on to our second point, prejudice. Prejudice is the consists of negative feelings about others because of their connection to a social group. For an example, you may have a negative attitude toward love songs. If you meet someone who writes love songs, you may choose to have a negative attitude toward them because of their music selection you don't like. And moving on into our last point, discrimination. Discrimination concerns behaviors, specifically negative behaviors, directed against a person because of their membership in a particular group. Examples of discrimination could be treating someone different because of their gender, race, age, or religious belief. To sum up this slide, stereotypes concern associations or beliefs, prejudice concerns feelings, and discrimination concerns behaviors. Keep in mind that stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination can operate somewhat independently, but they often influence and reinforce each other. In order to discuss the underlying nature of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, we have to address the primary focus on racism and sexism in particular. Given the complexity of these issues, defining concepts such as prejudice or racism is no simple matter. But in our textbook, racism is defined as a type of prejudice and discrimination based on a person's racial background or institutional and cultural practices that promote domination in one racial group over another. It is also important to keep in mind and in consideration that racism exists on several different levels. There are three different types of racism. There's modern racism, which is a form of prejudice that serves in subtle ways when it is safe, socially acceptable, and easy to rationalize. 2, there is aversive racism, which is racism that concerns the ambivalence between fair-minded attitudes and beliefs on one hand and unconscious and unrecognized feelings and beliefs on the other. And there's implicit racism, which is racism that operates unconsciously and unintentionally. Similarly, sexism is defined as prejudice and discrimination is based on a person's gender or as institutional and cultural practices promote the domination of one gender over another. In our tradition, the doctor is the first person to identify a boy and a baby girl. When a baby is born, the hospital usually gives the baby boy a blue hat and the baby girl a pink hat. And in the workforce, there are more men who become auto mechanics, airplane pilots, and engineers in contrast to women who are teachers, nurses, flight attendants, or even housewives. When trying to make sense of everything throughout the day, in some ways, social categorization is natural and adaptive. It allows us to form impressions quickly and use experience to guide new interactions. With so many things to pay attention to in our social world, we can save time and effort by using people's group memberships to make inferences about them. And as perceivers, we routinely sort each other into groups on the basis of gender, race, age, and other common attributes in a process called social categorization. For an example, studies have shown that people see racially ambiguous faces as darker, and they trigger more negative implicit association if the faces are labeled racially black than white. Moving on into the intergroup conflict, cooperation and shared goals are ideal for intergroup conflict to be successful. In a newly desegregated public school in Texas and in California, Elliot Aronson and his colleagues developed a cooperative learning method called the Jigsaw Classroom. In this study, they assigned fifth graders to small, racially and academically mixed groups to learn materials within the group as it was divided into subtopics, much the way a jigsaw puzzle is broken down into pieces. Each student was responsible for learning one piece of the puzzle, and after all the members took turns teaching their material to one another. In this system, everyone, regardless of race, ability, or self-confidence, they all needed each other to succeed. And when it comes to the stereotype threat can impair the performance and affect the identity of members of stereotyped or devalued groups. And slight changes in a setting can reduce stereotype threat and its negative effects significantly. In past research, Claude Steele proposed that in situations where a negative stereotype could be applied to a certain group members, these group members would operate in fear, seeing through the lenses of diminishing stereotypes and low expectations. In the Theories in Social Psychology textbook, Crosby, a researcher in 1976, referred to the relative deprivation (RD) theory as a deprivation experience relative to a shared standard, as opposed to being determined by some absolute measure of deprivation. As a relative deprivation is a construct used to explain paradoxes, in more detail it explained how people's subject comparisons influence their outlooks when they are confronted with the situations of inequality. The concept of relative deprivation has been used to explain why those who are not well off seem inactive, and the concept has also been invoked in situations in which people are dissatisfied or angry with their lot in life when they are not as poor off as others. Now we will begin discussing our first article, The Ironic Impact of Activists. Negative stereotypes reduce social change and influence. In 1964, the U.S. Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act, outlawing racial and gender discrimination. Despite recognizing the need for social change in areas such as equality and environmental protection, individuals often avoided supporting change. As the researchers in this study attempted to understand the resistance to social change by examining individuals' perceptions of social issues and change, they hypothesized that individuals would, in fact, resist social change because they have a negative stereotype of activists and the agents of social change. In this study, 3 pilot studies were conducted using 228 Americans online through an Amazon's Mechanical Turk website. The purpose of this study was to examine the influence of activist stereotypes on resistance to social change by influencing on 2 key activist groups, which were feminists and environmentalists. The groups were picked to show that they may have similar implications for resistance to social change. And as predicted, the researchers found that the majority of traits that the participants listed as being a characteristic of the typical feminist and environmentalist were militant and aggressive, and eccentric and unconventional traits. In conclusion, the participants believed both traits was considered to be a part of an activist trait group. And in the present study, the researchers conducted 5 different studies to show how individual stereotypes of activists increase the influence of social change. Although the researchers believed the term activist would be viewed favorably, the participants viewed it as a negative stereotype as it became associated with hostility. In this article, Music Preference, Social Identity, and Self-Esteem, the theorists believed that music was the preference way of signaling social identity and constitutes a window to an individual's identity. The social identity theory showed that membership to social groups served to enhance and maintain self-esteem, and in young people it played a prominent role in defining their social identity. In this study, self-esteem was measured from 199 university students from New Zealand who took 2 surveys who were given 2 sets of surveys. One, the RSES, which was a self-report that had 10 statements, and they had to report on a 4-Likert scale to provide a total score of self-esteem, ranging from 0 to 30. Scores below 15 were indicated as low self-esteem, and the short test of music preference, also known as the STOMP, was used as the participants rated how much they preferred a particular genre of music. Various genres covered from classical to heavy metal to pop or even religious music. In conclusion, the results reflected a number of interesting findings related to the relationship between music preference and self-esteem, the factor of RSES, and the predictions of social identity theory. The evidence found that there was no evidence supporting the relationship between the 10-time RSES and any of the music preferences derived from the STM P. And social identity theory was partially associated between group identification and self-esteem. This study also demonstrated that the measures of self-esteem need to be employed with care. In this presentation, we discuss social perception, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, issues underlining stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, social categories, relative deprivations, the two articles, The Ironic Impact of Activists, Negative Stereotypes Reduce Social Change and Influence, and Music Preference, and the article, Music Preference, Social Identity, and Self-Esteem. Before ending this presentation, I would like to ask two questions referring to the overall topic of this week's module, which was discrimination, prejudice, and stereotypes. The first question is, though the Bible tells us to love one another, in your opinion, why do so many struggle with accepting one another and our differences? And our second question is, do you think our perception change of others will change in the near future? Why or why not? Thank you so much for listening.